Hello, and welcome to Laugh and Learn Virtual Opera 101 with Central City Opera. Each week, we will familiarize ourselves with an upcoming production from Central City Opera's 2024 Summer Festival season. Today, we will learn about Kurt Weill's Street Scene. But first, a bit about Central City. Located 35 miles west of Denver at 8,500 feet above sea level in the Colorado mountain town of Central City Opera owns and maintains 27 Victorian-era properties, including the Teller House and the Opera House. CCO is the fifth oldest professional opera company in the country and is renowned for its exquisite summer festival. CCO is unique, defined by its jewel box opera house and its tradition and commitment to American opera, both in repertoire and through training programs. We offer creative education activities and community engagement throughout the year across the Denver metro area and the state of Colorado, as well as in virtual spaces through programming like Laugh and Learn and the CCO podcast. The Central City Opera Guild assists with historic preservation, apprentice artist support, community education, cultural and social events, and various fundraising campaigns throughout the year. Discover the rich tapestry of love, drama, and community at Central City Opera's captivating 2024 festival. Experience the timeless hilarity of Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta, The Pirates of Penzance. Savor the grandeur of Puccini's beloved, The Girl of the Golden West, and embrace the heart and soul of Kurt Weill's iconic American opera, Street Scene. The season runs June 29th through August 4th. Single tickets go on sale on April 1st, but subscriptions are already selling fast. In today's Laugh and Learn, CCO Director of Development, Megan Quilliam, will delve into Kurt Weill's Street Scene. Megan has been involved in arts administration in several locations and several local organizations since 2018. After completing her undergraduate degree in musicology at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music in Australia, Megan went on to obtain an arts administration certificate in 2019 and a PhD in ethnomusicology in 2023, both from the University of Colorado Boulder. While she was a doctoral candidate, Megan taught several courses at the College of Music, including music appreciation, world music, and the American film musical. For her doctoral research, Megan conducted ethnographic fieldwork in her home country of South Africa, focusing on the socio-political dimensions of opera and musical theater in the post-apartheid era. She has a chapter in an upcoming book about South African music to be published this month by Bloomsbury Press. Welcome, Megan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so honored to talk to you about this beautiful hybrid opera, music, and musical Street Scene by Kurt Weill and Langston Hughes. I've just completely fallen in love with this show, and even though it was composed more than 75 years ago, I feel that Street Scene can still show us something about ourselves. It's beautiful and gritty. It deals with very human things like love, loneliness, addiction, greed, ambition, happiness, as well as things that continue to dominate our headlines, like the immigrant experience and domestic violence. So first, just a very quick outline of what we'll be talking about today. I'm going to start with a little bit of background on this piece. We'll talk about Elma Rice, who wrote the play that Street Scene is based on. We'll also talk about who Kurt Weill is. And then we're going to delve into the plot of Street Scene by looking at who's who of our character list here. And then we'll focus on what happens in the first act or the first day of this show, and then the second act. And then we're going to spend some time talking about what even is this hybrid opera musical thing that we call Street Scene, before finally speaking about the leitmotifs, some of the leitmotifs that we can find in Street Scene. But if you don't know what that word leitmotif means, not to worry, we're going to start this presentation with a short glossary of terms that you might find useful. So first off, we'll start with leitmotif. A leitmotif is a musical theme or melody that recurs throughout a piece of music that carries with it some kind of extra musical meaning. The example I always like to give my students was dum 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 dum. And if you'll forgive my terrible singing, you'll recognize that as the Darth Vader theme from Star Wars. So even when you hear that theme and Darth Vader is not on screen, you know what's about to happen. You know what's coming and what that music represents. That's a great example of a leitmotif. Next up, we have a recitative versus an aria. Now, a recitative is a part of an opera where there is essentially sung dialogue that reproduces the rhythms of natural speech, often with very sparse accompaniment. The recitative sections are usually where the moments of action of an opera story take place, versus an aria, which is essentially an operatic song sung by one person, a lyrical monologue. Unlike recitative, an aria does not attempt to replicate the natural rhythms of speech. Instead, it's poetic, emotional, and very musical. The aria provides the audience a glimpse into the inner world and inner emotions of a character. And then finally, two words that I find very useful in describing a piece of music is dissonance versus consonance. They help us describe the kind of sound two or more musical notes make when we play them together. A dissonance is when you have musical notes that clash, that do not make a pleasing harmonious sound, versus consonance then, which is when musical notes combine to make a pleasing sound. Operatic composers use this tool to give us audible clues about the story we're listening to. On a very fundamental level, when we hear dissonance, we're supposed to pick up on something along the lines of fear, anger, darkness, tension, something fundamentally bad, versus when we hear a consonance, which is supposed to clue us in on happiness, harmony, something like that. So just a note before we get into the plot of Street Scene, or into the background of Street Scene, I relied heavily on these two books for this presentation and the research behind it, and I can't recommend both of them enough, especially if you're interested in learning more about Kurt Weill's music that he uses for his theatrical works. Stephen Hinton's book is wonderful. Naomi Graeber's book is an excellent look into Weill's time in America and how that influenced his works. Of the original play on which Street Scene is based, Kurt Weill once said, quote, "It was a simple story of everyday life in a big city, a story of love and passion and greed and death. I saw great musical possibilities in its theatrical device, life in a tenement house between one evening and the next afternoon. And it seemed like a great challenge to me to find the inherent poetry in these people and to blend my music with the stark realism of the play," end quote. And that play was, of course, the Pulitzer Prize-winning play Street Scene, written by Elmer Rice in 1929, which gave an intimate look into the daily lives of residents of a building in the city. Rice's play ran for 601 performances on Broadway and toured throughout the country. It was even later adapted into a film in 1931. So who was Kurt Weill then? A contemporary of Paul Hindemith, Weill was a German-born composer who became known for his works for the stage. His most famous work is the Threepenny Opera, a collaboration with Bertolt Brecht. You might know the now famous standard song Mac the Knife, which originally came from this opera. Weill had a successful career in his home country before fleeing the Nazis in 1933. He was, after all, a very popular Jewish composer whose views were officially denounced by the Nazi regime. And so he immigrated to the US, where he continued to build his stage career, this time on Broadway, and made significant efforts to study American popular music and the trends that dominated the American stage. In 1946, Weill joined the Playwrights Producing Company, the PPC, the first composer to do so, in fact. And this was a collective of writers who had pooled their resources to produce their own works. One of the founding members was, of course, Elma Rice. And after having seen a production of Rice's street scene while still in Germany, it seemed to be a natural progression that Weill finally approached Rice about adapting the play in the mid-1940s. They then both chose Harlem Renaissance poet Langston Hughes to write the libretto. Weill's street scene premiered in New York on January 9th, 1947, and it ran for 148 performances. So now let's get into the plot and take a look at who we're dealing with in Street Scene. There are about 32 roles in this work. 32, that's a huge number for a cast. It's far too many characters to examine with any depth here, but I'll try and touch on the most important ones. So the residents of the building in question are made up of these core families that you see on the screen now. The two primary families at the center of this story are the Morants and the Kaplans. The Morants are made up of Frank Morant, a stagehand, and not to immediately bring down everyone's mood, he also is an abusive alcoholic. He serves as the villain of the piece. Beyond being an abusive alcoholic, he also buys into ideologies that today we would find very old-fashioned and, frankly, repulsive, especially when it comes to his views about immigrants and women. Then there is his sweet, kind, loving wife, Anna, who is a romantic at heart and is desperate to find some kind of happiness, even when everything in her life seems to be miserable. Their daughter, Rose, is 20 and works in an office. Rose, like her mother, is also a hopeless romantic. She's holding out for the real thing, her true love. Their son, Willie, is young and mischievous. The Kaplans, then, are a kind of foil for the Morants, at least that's how I see them. The father, Abraham, is an older Jewish man and politically liberal. He's the very antithesis of Frank Morant. His son, Sam, is very intellectual. A recent college graduate, he reads a book a day. He's also hopelessly in love with Rose Morant. His sister, Shirley, is very protective of her brother. Watch out for how she feels she has to intervene when she sees a relationship forming between Sam and Rose. Take a look at some of the other families who live in this brownstone. I'll let you read through this list yourselves, but I'd like you to notice two things. The first is the fact that Rice and then Weill want to highlight the very real, very human issues being faced by these characters, some of which I've outlined here. Alcoholism, lower socioeconomic status, being dispossessed of your own home in the case of the Hildebrand family. Again, it's gritty and dark, but it's extremely beautiful because of that, because it's so human. And then number two, I'd like you to notice the multicultural nature of the building's residential makeup. We have the Olsons from Sweden, the Fiorentinos, where she's from Germany and he's Italian. This is truly a multi-ethnic, multicultural building. Then we have the visitors to the building. These are Dick McGann, Harry Easter, and most importantly, I would say, Steve Sankey, who's the milk collector thought to be Anna Morant's love interest. Now, I'd like to take us back to this slide here, if I may. One theme that runs throughout Street Scene has, of course, to do with the immigrant experience. It's a very interesting dimension to the story, especially in Act 1 on the first day. So before we dive into the plot, I'd like to spend some time giving you some more background on this. By the time that Weill's adaptation opened on Broadway in 1947, urban demographics had changed significantly since Elma Rice first penned this story about a tenement filled with immigrant neighbors. According to Naomi Graber, whereas, quote, mixed ethnic neighborhoods were commonplace in 1929, by 1947, urban demographics had begun to shift, and this kind of neighborhood began to seem anachronistic, end quote. She describes how these shifts led to changing conceptions of both race and what it means to be American. So in the 19th century, Irish, Italian, Jewish, Finnish, Greek, and Polish immigrants were all seen to be from different races, which led to a lot of antagonism and ill treatment. Later, beginning in the 1920s, this began to change when these groups began to view themselves as ethnics instead of races, thereby creating a monolithic white race. Thanks in part to government policy that began after the war to award favorable loans from the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Authority to all of these groups except African Americans, white immigrants left the city to take advantage. This is why the cityscape Elmer Rice captures in 1929 seemed to be so anachronistic after Weill adapted the play in 1947. Post-war American society seemed also to favor the idea of assimilation over expression of individual immigrant identity, and this is reflected in the final product of Street Scene we see today. Originally, Weill had envisioned this work to celebrate immigration and American multiculturalism on several different levels. He had sketched out several songs that highlighted American cultural plurality, songs that spoke of the melting pot that is America, etc. All of these did not make the final cut. Thanks to the political situation America found itself in the late 1940s, Weill opted instead to tone down some of the political dimensions of what he had originally envisioned. So just a little bit of background there for you on some of the important elements here. Let's dive into the plot now. We start on the first day. The story, of course, takes place over 2 sweltering days in June on the stoop of a brownstone tenement in New York City. On the evening of the first day, the residents go about their business, a very core part of which is gathering to complain about the weather and to gossip about each other. The opening measures of Street Scene's score, however, really paint a musical picture. Dissonant clashes and driving rhythms that represent the busyness and the bustle of a big city. It reminds me a lot of the opening measures of Gershwin's An American in Paris in the way that you can hear the chaos of the Parisian traffic. So we're going to take a listen here to the opening measures of Street Scene. A show's opening number is supposed to set the tone for the rest of the show, and Street Scene's opening number certainly achieves just that. It's called Ain't It Awful, the Heat, and we're going to listen to it here in a bit. I'd like you to listen out for the heavy influences coming from jazz and blues in this opening number. Soon, the neighbors fall into gossiping. The focus of their nattering is Anna Morant. Is she having an affair with the handsome milkman, Mr. Sankey? Well, they certainly seem to think so, and their judgment of her is fairly brutal, considering how obvious Frank's drinking and fits of rage are to everyone. Anna's character has a lot of depth, which her neighbors don't seem to know or care to realize. We get a wonderful aria from Anne Morant in Act 1 called Somehow I Never Could Believe. It's her first aria of the show, where she introduces herself to the audience and explains her optimism for brighter days ahead despite the trouble she faces. Scholars have pointed to the very Puccini-esque nature of this aria, with particular ties to Madame of Butterfly. Now, what I did here, if you could go back one slide, Lauren, was to give you an excerpt from Stephen Hinton's book, specifically about this wonderful aria that we get from Anne Morant. And you can see, as he outlines what the song is about, the episodic nature of this long and beautiful song, where she talks about some of her early dreams as a child and her expectations for her life and how some of those haven't come to fruition, but also about the joy she gets from her children and her faith that there will be brighter days ahead. So we'll go into the next slide and to play just a small part of this aria.
Somehow I never could believe that life was meant to be dull and gray. Somehow I always will believe there'll be a brighter day.
When she's finished singing, Sankey the milkman walks by on his way to pick up something. The tension between Anna and Sankey is clear, setting the neighbors to even more gossip. The neighbors then find some relief from the heat with the ice cream Mr. Fiorentino has brought home for everyone. The so-called ice cream sextet that follows is a fun exploration by the building's residents, many of whom are immigrants, remember, of that most American of things, the ice cream cone. As Naomi Graber puts it, quote, "The ice cream sextet became the most memorable ensemble of the act, showing that no matter where someone comes from, everyone loves America. Differences melt away, pun intended, into one homogeneous ensemble," end quote. Talk amongst the neighbors is quickly directed towards ideology around things like how to raise your children. Different backgrounds, of course, yield different answers. Heated discussions of politics soon follow, especially between Frank Moran and Abraham Kaplan. But soon it's nighttime and the neighbors say goodbye. Everyone heads indoors except for Sam, who sings of his loneliness despite being surrounded by people and the busy animation of the city all the time. So we're going to take a quick listen to a famous aria that Sam sings called Lonely House.
At night, when everything is quiet, this old house seems to breathe a sigh. Sometimes I hear a neighbor snoring. Sometimes I hear a baby cry.
Eventually, Rose arrives home accompanied by her boss, Harry Easter, who's married but clearly wants to be in a relationship with her, something that Rose does not reciprocate. The end of Act 1 gives us our first glimpse at the budding relationship between Rose and Sam. Ever the optimist, just like her mom, Rose reassures a depressed Sam. He thinks life is nothing but pain. Using the metaphor of a lilac bush, she reminds him of the beauty to be found in life and that she cares about him. Early the next morning, the neighborhood children play and sing songs. There's been a baby born to the Buchanan family in the building during the night. Anna Morant helped to deliver that baby, but because she's been gone all night, Frank confronts her, accusing her of having had an affair. Eventually, Rose even gets involved to defend her mother. Later, Rose and Sam meet up again. Sam thinks they should run away together. But just as Rose leaves to go to a work commitment, leaving Sam on the stoop, who should walk by but Sankey the milkman, who heads upstairs to see Anna Morant. So it turns out they are having an affair. But that's where I'm going to leave it for you. You'll just have to go to our production in July to learn what happens next. Let's talk about definitions here. We talk about Street Scene being a hybrid musical and opera. Why? What does that mean? This is the type of thing that truly lights up the heart of a musicologist like me. But it seemed that Weill himself didn't really even know how to classify Street Scene either. Originally, it was billed as a dramatic musical. However, Weill once wrote to his friend that street scene was, quote, a type of number opera. But, he continued, I composed right through the spoken dialogues between the musical numbers like a recitative, so that the dialogue melts into the musical numbers and creates a unity of drama and music that I had never achieved before, end quote. Elsewhere, he had referred to it as a, quote, real Broadway opera, and later as an American opera. He also described it as the culmination of his career in musical theater. So which is it and why? Well, let's take a look at some of the reasons it might not be an opera. First of all, it opened on Broadway and ran for 148 performances. Certainly a great many more performances than a standard run of an opera would be, right? It won the first Tony Award all the way back in 1947. A Tony Award for an opera? It is not sung through. There are long stretches of spoken dialogue during which the action occurs instead of a recitative. There are a great many musical numbers in the score that are decidedly unoperatic. They're pop songs a la Tin Pan Alley. They're repetitive, extremely catchy, and heavily influenced by both jazz and blues. So let's take a look at one of those examples right now, and this is Moon-Faced, Starry-Eyed.
Moon-faced, starry-eyed, peaches and cream with nuts on the side. I never knew there was anyone living like you. Moon-faced, starry-eyed, I'm gonna bust my breast with pride. I never lived, baby, not at all, till I met you.
An earworm for sure, but it definitely does not sound like an operatic aria, right? So what songs in Street Scene do sound like operatic arias? Let's take this opportunity to have a look at all of the numbers in Street Scene and how I would classify them. And these numbers highlighted in green are the ones that I think sound the most Broadway. And I do anticipate that many of you might disagree with some of these, and so I've put my email address down. Please reach out, let's chat about this. I look forward to it. So if we look at all of these green ones, and Lauren, you're welcome to switch between the first day and the second day and back, so we get a sense of all of these. If we look at all the green ones, what about these other ones? These others are part of the reason this can be called an opera. The pattern we start to see emerge, and this is, idea is largely taken from Stephen Hinton's book, is that it's almost like Weill wrote the core of the story as an opera. The major songs sung by the main characters, and that's Frank, Anna, Rose, and Sam for the most part. These are typically more operatic. They're arias as opposed to pop songs. So if we skip to the next page with just the arias on them, what I think Weill has effectively done is almost to create a smaller opera for the main characters, the Morantz and Sam Kaplan, within the boundaries of a larger work that is more diverse, musically speaking. The result is exactly what I think Weill intended it to be, a perfectly hybrid product. And this hybrid form suited his dramatic needs. It was the gritty realism of Elmer Rice's play that he wanted to replicate on the musical stage, after all. But he felt that the operatic form might not provide enough of that realism. Weill wrote, quote, I had made up my mind to really write an opera for Broadway, something that I'd been planning and preparing for years. The great challenge for me was to find a form that translated the realism of the plot into the music. The result is something entirely new and probably the most modern form of musical theater, since it applies the technique of opera without ever falling into the artificiality of opera, end quote. So the answer is that whatever we call this piece of work doesn't really matter. It serves Weill's dramatic purposes regardless. Stephen Hinton reminds us, quote, the urban space which Street Scene represents thus finds an analog for its ethnic diversity in its musical diversity, end quote. There is one operatic device that Weill uses willingly and prolifically, that is the leitmotif, or the recycling of previously heard music. Now, what I always encourage people to think about when they are listening and hunting for leitmotifs is, why would a composer recycle and reuse a piece of music? What message are they trying to get across to the audience? Let's talk about one of the most prominent, I think, leitmotifs. We have to go right back to the beginning of the opera to hear one of the most important ones. It's associated with Sam's iconic aria, Lonely House. What I'm going to play for you here is 3 iterations of this leitmotif. The first is the most obvious, from Sam's Lonely House aria. And now when we heard this earlier, I cut it off before we got to the moment where he sings the words Lonely House. That's the real memorable part of the opera. So you're going to hear that part right now. Then I'm going to take us back right to the beginning of the opera to hear the same leitmotif, although this time it sounds quite different. It's still the same Lonely House melody for sure, but it's being harmonized by extremely dissonant chords. And then finally, I'm going to take us deep into Act 2, just after Sankey the milkman makes his fateful walk up the stairs to see Anna Morand, where I left off my synopsis earlier. We hear again this Lonely House motif recycled here. So the trick is always to ask why a composer would recycle this musical material. What musical clue is he leaving us about this story? I'll let you determine that when you come and see this show during the summer. But let's take a listen to those 3 instances right now. So there are a few more brief leitmotifs I want to draw your attention to. The next one has become known as the fate motif. And if you know the opera Carmen well, you know that there's a similar kind of fate motif operating in that opera. I won't say too much about it, but we'll take a listen to it. In the first scene, it's one of the first interactions between Anna Morand and Frank, her husband, during this first day. And you're going to hear the theme being played, given to us by the lower parts of the orchestra. And then finally, it's going to jump to, in fact, the last measure of the entire opera, where you're going to hear that same fate motif again, a little bit slowed down for dramatic effect. But take it away, Lauren.
It's a wonderful thing to be young like that. And good evening, Mr. Morant.
Evening. Some honey of a tale.
Have you been working all this while?
I'll say. Dress rehearsal with lights in this weather.
So hopefully you heard the similarities between those 2 instances of this motif here. If we go to the next slide here, this is a quote I drew from Stephen Hinton's book about this fate motif. And of course, when we hear it in that first instance I just played for you, it's one of the first times we see Frank. So it seems to be attached to Frank's character. However, as the opera goes on, this theme seems to transcend that. So what Stephen Hinton says is, quote, thanks to its frequent recurrence, the motif ends up standing for much more than Frank or the crime of passion he commits, spoilers, in the heat of the moment. When it puts in its last, arguably incongruous appearance in the opera's penultimate measure, the motif seems to have transcended Frank's actions and the misfortune they have wrought, to represent symbolically the all-too-human element that inescapably injects itself into the lives of the community, end quote. And then the last motif I want to end on is attached to Anna Morant's aria that we heard earlier. So you're going to hear this "somehow I never could believe" line again. We heard it just a bit earlier. And then you're going to hear it a second time sung by a different character in a completely different context with a little bit of different manipulation of some of the musical elements here. I'm not going to say too much about what's happening in that second instance because it gives away a little bit too much, but take a listen.
Somehow I never could believe that life was made to be all dull and gray.
Now love and death have linked their arms together and gone away into another world.
So I really enjoy listening for leitmotifs, and I encourage you to keep an ear out for that when you come to see the show this summer. Speaking of which, Street Scene opens on July 13th and runs through August 3rd. I really hope you'll join us for this amazing icon of American opera. And to that end, I'm going to spend some time talking about who is involved in our production, because that has been announced now. Regular patrons of Central City Opera will certainly recognize quite a few names here, but we'll also notice a few new names to our principal artist list for this production. The director and choreographer for Street Scene this year will be Daniel Pelzik. The conductor will be Adam Turner. Anna Morant will be played by Catherine Pracht, Frank Morant by Kevin Burdett, Rose Morant by Christy Conover, and Sam Kaplan by Christian Sanders. Also, principal artists will be Greta Fiorentina will be played by Veronique Filou, Emma Jones will be played by Hilary Ginter, and Harry Easter will be played by Isaiah Fagan. And we have a few more names of the cast list for you. And once again, my email address is mquilliam@centralcityopera.org. Please reach out with any questions, or if you disagree with me on any of the parts of my song list. And thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you this summer.
Thank you again so much for joining us for Laugh and Learn Virtual Opera 101 with Central City Opera. See you next time.